You guys ready to meet our panelists? All right. Paul Winn, Managing Partner at Smart Media Group. Please come to the stage, Paul. Rebecca Rinkevich, Director of Political Programs at Pulpit Interactive. We had a slight change in our lineup today. Carol Mundy could not join us today because she's suffering from bronchitis. So Charmion Kinder so graciously stepped up to be on our panel today. Charmion Kinder, Chief Impact Officer, CNKinder Incorporated, and former press aide and Officer of the First Lady. Marc Banks, National Press Secretary, NAACP. I'll join you guys. All right. So we're in a political year that's pretty much started off like no other ever that we've ever seen. And we just saw some pretty cool research. So what's interesting to me is I guess I'm not surprised that 83% of voters think that they can't trust political advertising. But I am surprised that 82% think that they need it because it educates them. So why don't we just start right there? What are each of you seeing in the way of new challenges to reaching voters at a time when there's so much content and there's just so much noise out there? Paul, you want to start?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Mark. So there's a few things we look to, and when we think about voters, their consumption is just more fragmented than it's ever been, right? It used to be when I started doing this that you could get away with doing a few things. That's not the case anymore, right? You have to reach them across as many mediums as possible. And so I have the fortunate view of being able to look at a lot of polling data, right? And so we get to see the seen, read, heard in real time. You would not believe how many polls a campaign will air or will actually conduct. So we get a lot of real-time feedback. And so when we look at this, the best thing is multiple media running at the same time, right? There's no one thing that can go and move voters anymore. It has to be in conjunction with a lot of different forms of media.
What are some of the new asks that you're getting from clients?
So I would say that we have been historically a very heavy dominated television media. And now we are trying to figure out how to reach those quote unquote cord cutters. That is a question that all campaigns are asking now. It used to be when, just a couple of years ago, that digital was kind of a thing that you needed, right? It was, give me a little bit of digital here. We know we need it. We're not really sure what it does, but we need to be a smart campaign, so put a little bit of it on there. And you're seeing a lot more digital first campaigns. We track, as I know Bully Pulpit does as well, we track all the spending that Facebook and Google releases. And we tracked over $350 million in 2019 alone, just on Facebook and Google, which we would argue somewhere represents between maybe 50 to 75% of a campaign's digital spending there. And so we're tracking all advertisers that spend more than $5,000. So that's a huge pot of money in a non-election year, right? It's an odd number year, and you're still seeing $350 million spent. So that's the big thing that we're seeing. Campaigns are much more digital first. I will tell you that the Trump campaign, the Obama campaign really was revolutionary in a lot of ways. The Trump campaign really, and I'm not on the inside there, but they are really a digital-first campaign. They're getting out there and they're securing a lot of inventory now, and they really look to spend their first dollar on matched audience, specific swing voters or whatever their targets may be, where that's not really been the case for a lot of big campaigns up to this point.
So Rebecca, just adding on to that, digital is definitely playing a bigger role. And some campaigns are digital first, like Paul mentioned. So talk to us a little bit about how digital is being used, innovative ways or beyond just Facebook and social.
That's my favorite question. What's happening beyond Facebook? And I just to reiterate your points exactly, what we're getting asked for a lot is a real comprehensive cross-channel look at digital advertising. Digital is no longer living in a silo aside from TV. Those two things are very much in conversation, and increasingly our clients are coming to us and asking for a full look at all the touch points we can have with a voter. Some interesting things we're seeing, I mean, just to take a pause and talk about all of the regulation changes we've seen with digital media this year. There's less and less first-party targetable creative media. And that's always been the case with the most impactful media. A lot of connected TV and full episode players have always been less targetable or had less scale with first party. So a lot of the things we're really excited about are people and clients looking towards digital as a broadcast medium. So going to Hulu, going to D2 and Xandr, and really running broadcast impactful video at scale.
So the research that we just saw shows that voters will watch a TV ad all the way through, but on social media, maybe not so much. So given that digital is where consumers are, how are you increasing the efficiency of digital video campaigns?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, always having an eye towards viewability and audibility, and also recognizing that we need to hit people at a higher frequency than we do with TV. If someone's sitting down and watching a TV ad, you have their attention fully captured. On digital, they're a little bit more schizophrenic.
Sure.
So optimizing our campaigns for attention specifically is something that we do consistently across all our campaigns.
So equally in activism as in politics, we're trying to get people to, I don't know, I guess the question I want to ask is, how do you appeal to what people care about?
Yeah.
Charmion,
So,
how do we
Marc,
do that?
I would say, I'm actually one of a great case scenario of this. I was working at the Ad Council, actually, in 2008, when I watched a speech from a former senator from Illinois. And the phrase I heard was, nothing can stand in the way of millions of voices calling for change. And I sat at work and I'm like, wow, I'm working on a number of different social issues. He's right. I felt included. I remembered that phrase. And I actually quit and went and organized in Missouri. So that the actual messaging, all of the different things that they repeated, the arc of the moral universe, or the universe, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I've mangled that, but you all remember it. But the point is, we repeated it over and over and over again. And when I ended up organizing, I repeated that over and over and over again. And we brought way more people into the fold. So there are a couple of things. One is the youth demographic is really cutting the cord. You really can't be around the table and only talk about TV now if you expect to include all of America, which is why I believe that the digital revolution and digital first has been so effective, because you can access it on your phones, you can access it on your laptop. You don't necessarily have to have cable to get messages, right? So that's first. Second of all is, what are you saying to people that includes them? So yes, everyone here, I'm sure, either has a niece or a nephew or a son or a daughter thinking about school, or they want to keep their house, or they want to have the ability to be promoted. All these themes are things that we had to worry about in governance. And ultimately, it's what political candidates are talking about. So when you're able to lift that up, where it goes across the aisle, not just Republican or Democrat, and really speak to people about the issues that impact their lives directly, a lot of times your advertising will be a lot more effective, because people really let their guard down more and really listen to the issues that you're talking about. So I think really sort of digital first, making sure you raise the issues up to be issue connected so that people can really listen to what you're saying, and then also including different voices around the table are really relevant and important for this current electorate.
And we just saw in the research also that people want to be informed. They want ads that inspire them, right? So, Marc, I know you've done a wealth of research on voter sentiment, and a lot of this research had to do with voter sentiment. So what have you noticed in this particular political year that's different than the last cycle? Or what can you tell us about voter sentiment?
Well, we did a number of focus groups around the country. We did Miami, we did Detroit. I can't think of the last one we did, but we went around the country and we spoke with a number of different voters to get where they were and what they were thinking about this election. I'll be honest, a lot of them were apathetic, and a lot of them just didn't have the information. They weren't informed. So even after that focus group we did, we asked the question, would you have your views changed? Are you more interested in voting? And they said yes. And I think it was just a matter of them sitting down, having the conversations with some people on the ground, grassroots activism, really, and having that conversation face to face. So I think that plays a big part when they can feel like they're getting the information from a trusted source. So I think that plays a big part. I don't know how that really correlates to the advertising, but I think if there's a way for us to connect with them on a grassroots level in advertising, it'll be more effective.
Awesome. Let's stay on grassroots for a second. So grassroots movements are very important. We've seen that with Bernie Sanders. We've seen it with Joe Biden to some extent. Charmion, you relayed a story about Jim Clyburn in South Carolina.
Yes.
Please share that.
Yeah, I thought it was really incredible. We all saw this, right? Vice President Biden was sort of really discounted with a number of different political commentators. And what ended up happening, I think, is that Jim Clyburn, who is someone who people trust, he's been in the field for many years. There is a history there of the work that he's been doing in South Carolina, that coalition building, the actual work that's been on the ground. I believe that the campaign tapped into that. And having a validator like that really does change how people react. So I think it's the marriage of really effective messages, going to find people where they are, not only broadcast, but then also social, but then marrying that with something real, with real people. Authenticity really still counts. And I believe that him speaking up and saying issues, again, that matter to people, instead of, I just care about this candidate or this candidate is bad, as we saw with some of the stats, the negativity doesn't necessarily inspire people to activism or to move, to vote. And I thought that his endorsement really did change the tide with people who remembered the vice president's record at that time and really sort of helped them to make their decision.
If I could jump in, one thing that we convey at the NAACP, we say this election is not about the candidates, it's about people, it's about you. So we try to convince them that when you go into that ballot box or whatever your issues are, think about what your issues are, not the candidate. So vote for which candidate aligns best with what you believe, what you want to see done, and then elect that candidate and then move them closer to what you want to see done in your community.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that.
Can I jump in for 1 second, Mark?
Yeah.
I think it's important to note that when you talk about the average voter, the amount of political information that they're taking in is really small. They're not like the rest of us, right? We live in a little bit of a bubble here, and I live in D.C. I'm sure most of you are in New York. We consume a lot more political information than the average person in Iowa, Orlando, or even Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so they're not quite as nuanced on these issues. And so when you talk about negative advertising, right? Hey, do you like negative advertising? No, nobody does, right? But at the end of the day, what they're doing is they're trying to make a decision between two people. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to just draw a contrast, right? We call them contrasts. Some people call them negative ads. But hey, here's what I believe. Here's what the other person believes. Which one is closer to you, right? And so your advertising is always going to paint you in a better picture. And so if you can shout louder than somebody else, that's what works. And so it's just, like I said, it's important to understand what everybody's dealing with. As Charmaine mentioned, they're dealing with a lot of other things in their lives, and they're not necessarily living politics 24/7 like we are.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but negative ads, for the most part, are generated by the PACs, not really the candidates.
60% of the ads that air overall, we track all the ads all across the country, all political ads, are negative ads. And they draw a contrast between PACs. That ends up being about 90% of the ads that they air are negative, and campaigns are closer to about 50-50. Campaigns still have to draw this contrast between themselves and their opponents. You can't leave it up to anybody else to do it. But yes, the PACs. And so one of the interesting parts about the Democratic primary right now is that 95% of the spending is coming from candidates. So you're not seeing that contrast right there. There's so much, PAC money is so negatively viewed amongst Democratic voters right now that Bernie Sanders could really use a PAC out there highlighting a lot of the stances that Biden has had in the past, right? There's a lot of Biden is somebody that's been in Washington. Not that Sanders is a newcomer for a long time, and he has a voting record that doesn't necessarily match up to the views of a lot of Democratic voters. But there's no PAC out there to draw that contrast, and the Sanders campaign is a little bit different than most in the fact that that he doesn't believe in doing it himself either. So it's very, very fascinating right now. But that's going to change. Once we get into a general election, you're going to see plenty of negative ads. So anybody out there yearning for negative ads, just wait. They're coming.
Yeah, I think what I would add is it's super dependent on where you are in the election cycle. So, further out in the Democratic primary, everyone was trying to define themselves. And we saw as we got a little bit closer to Super Tuesday that people were starting to draw a light contrast. But I totally agree with Mark. It's definitely going to ramp up over the summer and into the fall.
Well, you're already seeing it, right? You're already seeing, the biggest Democratic PAC, Priorities USA, is already on the air. There's another one called American Bridge. They're out there while the Democrats are figuring out who their nominee is going to be. They're trying to keep the focus on the president and make sure that that voters understand how he affects them negatively. So yeah, it's already happening, right?
So staying on the primary for a second, Paul, I know you're really close to the spending stats for 2020. And the primary spend has already topped $1 billion, right? So how long do you predict that the primary fight's going to go on?
So we track all the spending, as Mark mentioned. So we have tracked $1.1 billion just in the Democratic presidential primary alone. One of the interesting things that we've seen so far is broadcast television is still the big point of that. But second right now is digital. Digital makes up 25% of the spending in the Democratic primary so far. And a large bit of that number is Bloomberg, as was pointed out, right? He spent $570 million. And he was he spent more on digital than anybody else. It would astound you. He was spending $15 million a week at the end, right? Unheard of. If we had $15 million to spend on digital for an entire campaign, that's an enormous budget, right? I can't think of how many I've had, right? I'm sure you could count them on one hand, right? The question was how long do we see this primary going on? With Bernie involved, I don't think he's a guy that's going to wave the white flag here early. He can raise money. He's got those low dollar donors that seem to be with him until the end, and I think he feels like it was taken away from him last time around, and I know his supporters feel that way, and I don't think he's going to give in until the end. The fascinating thing is the consolidation that you've seen behind Biden. It's unbelievable to see how quickly that, for lack of a better term, moderate wing of the Democratic Party has gotten behind him, and it was pointed out the endorsement of Congressman Clyburn. The consolidation of the African American vote that Biden has had is unbelievable, and it's interesting to think, but it's not surprising in hindsight, because when you look at the verbatims, the most voters, what they know about Biden is that he was Obama's vice president, and if you look at the numbers for Obama. Somebody get lost? If you look at the numbers for Obama, he had a 70 to 80% strong approval rating amongst African American voters throughout his presidency. I mean, they were with him come hell or high water. I mean, that the favorable was in the 90s. The strong favorable was in the 70s and 80s the entire time. So the fact that that's all that African American voters know about Biden is enough for them, right? And that gets reinforced in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, so Mark, I'm thinking now about emerging voter blocks, since you just mentioned African American voters, other minority voters. So what's the key to tapping into emerging voter blocks like Latino, LGBTQ, African American voters, independents? What's the key here?
Yeah, I think you have to speak to their issues. I think they've probably heard it all before, but when you get granular and really speak to what they're dealing with, I think that's big into tapping into them. And then as we see mediums change of how we reach those different demographics and those target audiences, you have to get onto those platforms or go to where they are. I think we're in the midst of a lot of things changing. Like she said, people are cutting the cord. So I think after this, we'll see where we land, and where that is where we need to start to put our resources, our dollars, and go after them in that way. So I don't know where we'll land after this, but I think when we do figure out after this election where we see things are, that's probably where we're going to be for a while.
And I would like to dovetail and sort of say, I think there's a traditional emerging voting bloc, but we are not our grandparents, right? African American voters are not necessarily anymore. We haven't directly experienced, Jim Crow or segregation. And so many of us are sitting next to you at your cubes running your businesses. Many of us care about 401ks just like you. We have purchased homes, we have children. Same thing with the Latino bloc, same thing with the LGBTQ bloc. We are American. And I think being advertisers and realizing that, looking at some of your consumer data and figuring out how that applies to the current landscape, you will find that to be a lot more effective, because that's actually how the voting bloc has emerged.
Is anybody doing it right? We only have really 3 main presidential candidates. Is anybody doing it?
I'm not necessarily endorsing this candidate or any candidate, but I would say that, Bernie Sanders is doing a phenomenal job of connecting with Americans on their issues, what they care about. Do you want to go to college? Well, is debt weighing you down? Really talking to people about what is coming out of their pockets and how they're living their lives. And anytime you're able to theme together what people are emotionally feeling or experiencing or going through, you're going to be effective with moving them to action. I have a vested interest in, specifically because I've already served in administration, I think about our troops first. I think about the way our government operates first. I've sort of seen it on the other side. And we still need to function as a country, still need to be ready when coronavirus hits us, and we need to work together to keep the country going. We need to be great global citizens and citizens to the world. So you need strong candidates in the pipeline to do that, Republican or Democrat. And I'm looking forward to us getting back to speaking to people in a way that they understand their civic duty to participate. And the only way that you can do that is banding them together on the issues.
And I will say, I think, as we navigate this wild Democratic primary, there's a lot of outside groups that are doing really incredible work in this space. When I think about millennials and the youth vote, Next Gen America has built an incredible field and digital operation since 2014, and they really continue to carry the water there. The ACLU in 2018 did an incredible job of taking their activists and their donors and converting them into voters. So even when all of the kerfuffle of the Democratic primary wages on, we're really seeing outside groups step up and drive with emerging coalitions and the youth vote in particular, I think.
Yeah, it's really important because I have a note here about millennials. There's 70 million that's eligible voters that are millennials. That's 30% of all eligible voters. So I mean, traditionally that's a group that doesn't vote, doesn't turn out, but that's a winning formula right there. If you can get the millennials to turn out and vote, right? So motivating them might be hard, but there's organizations that are on it.
Totally, and a thing that we've found really interesting, particularly with younger voters, is to our previous conversation about folks just consuming less political content, they want to feel informed. So serving them with educational content and things as, straightforward as a voter guide really changes their attitudes towards voting. We've also found that they need an extra touch. So it's not just about traditional persuasion and then pivoting right into GOTV. They need a sort of hybrid campaign, which is motivational. Why do you vote? Why is it important? Your vote means X, Y, and Z. And that's something that we've seen have a huge impact in elections like Virginia in 2017 and 2019. And something that we'd love to see Democrats invest more in 2020.
There's a lot of interesting things there, Marc. So when you think about who's doing the minority outreach well, I wouldn't wade into that conversation, but it's happening a lot. It's a very important part of the Democratic primary vote. Arguably 50% of the electorate in a lot of these Democratic primaries are people of color. And so you're seeing the outreach from these two campaigns, right? Both Bernie and Biden. Bloomberg spent $16 million, which was more than Obama spent in 2012 on Hispanic media. So there's a lot of effort there. And even the president believes that if he can siphon off a certain amount of the African-American vote, that he can make the difference in a lot of these states for him. So you're seeing all campaigns are really focused on this. I'm a little bit skeptical when it comes to the millennial vote. You haven't seen anybody other than Obama really be able to move these people to vote in large percentage, or this group to vote in large percentages. I have trouble thinking that two 70-year-olds, regardless of who ends up on the top of the ticket, is going to be. The thing that I would I would accept an argument, though, is that maybe Donald Trump can push them out to vote in a negative fashion, so that you're seeing turnout rise across the board in these Democratic primaries. Not so much amongst younger voters at this point, but maybe that changes. They don't tend to ever really vote in primaries. They've never gotten involved in a significant way in any primaries, so maybe that changes in the general election. But they certainly didn't show up in 2016, and that was a big thing that hurt Hillary Clinton in a lot of these states.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a conversation we're having a lot with our clients is how do you model and project turnout in such a funny election cycle like this one. The best we can do is look at 2018 and the way things are trending, and I think we feel pretty good there. And it'll be a really interesting next couple of months to see how folks are able to motivate the youth and get them to turn out in November.
That is one of the interesting conversations from 2018, was that the Democrats were able to turn out their voters at close to a presidential level. And that was what made the difference in the off-cycle election, right? So much of the conversation is focused around these independent voters. Hey, where are the independent voters going? But a lot of what our campaigns focus on is, hey, if we have a large enough coalition to win, how do we motivate those people to actually show up? And that was really the story in 2016, right? The Trump campaign, they had a smaller base, but they did a better job of turning that percentage out. And the Clinton campaign just didn't where it mattered. And you know, the opposite was true in 2018, right? Democrats turned out where they needed to, and the turnout in the Democratic primaries looks high. Super Tuesday, it was ridiculous in a lot of the suburban counties, which should be good news for whoever the Democratic nominee is going to be. But it's tough to say, right? Oh, who's going to win until we get down to that final choice, right? Oh, well, if it's Biden versus Trump, or if it's Bernie versus Trump, right? Until you have that choice in front of you, you can't make any judgments, right? Because as I mentioned, we're following this day to day. Oh, Clyburn endorsed and Bernie was in Detroit, but most voters aren't. Right? It's kind of all coming at them as a blur, and they're going to make their decision. Hey, maybe October 15th, I'll watch a debate, I'll read a little bit of an editorial, and kind of figure out who I connect with most. And it's not sad. It's not sad to me. It's just a reality, right? They have busy lives. They don't get paid to do this like I do. So
let's stay on strategy and turnout just for a second. 3 stats: 1/3 of TV ads go unseen. 35% of video consumption for Americans over 18 is via a streaming service. 28% of TV viewers watch on a smartphone. So given that, what are the untapped platforms in 2020 that have not historically been leveraged for turnout?
Well, I can sort of speak to this first. It's a little bit unconventional because as we mentioned, I had a chance to work for the First Lady, and we actually weren't very political at all. We would show up a lot of times at like the David Letterman show. And in this case, I'm sure the First Lady, I haven't looked lately, but it's showing up on TikTok or Instagram. She's showing up with celebrities. There is a way to go outside of the political box and really use our creativity to make sure that we are indeed speaking to the youth vote. It doesn't, you're right, I look a little bit older than I am, or younger than I am, but I have been working in politics for 16 years, which is how I even got into it. It's because people kept telling me that we refused to vote. And it was right. I kept getting around it. We would lose election after election. I would get around the table and I'd be like, it did not move from 23%. We just can't get to 50 or 100. And I haven't given up on us since. I still call us because even though I've gotten older, I think there are ways to make sure that you are streaming together again issues, going to different platforms, speaking to young people in unconventional ways that are not just broadcast media or not a traditional TV ad that they don't see themselves or their stories in. This authenticity is really key to moving the youth vote. And I think the more that we are able to tell stories that reflect what young people are living every day, the more we can include them in the process. So I really think that the digital first piece that you talked about is vital for that. And new emerging digital platforms, and speaking to them not about the healthcare stats, but more about what their best friend may have gone through when they had to go to the hospital for cancer treatment, right? Let's simplify the terms, and let's talk in stories, and let's use real people, and I think they'll participate in that way.
To piggyback on the real people piece, and as Paul mentioned, a lot of people, we're engaged in this conversation, but there's so many who don't have the privilege. I call it a privilege to be engaged in this process. So when we were doing our focus groups around the country, it dawned on me that this is such a privilege. Like, these people were just kind of, they had so much going on in their lives. They had to get to work, they had to do this, they had to go home and take care of their kids. They really didn't have the opportunity to engage in, well, let me look up this stat. Let me find out, who's doing that or doing this. So I think when we think about it that way, if we can, like you said, speak to their issues, speak to what they're going through, and then pull them in through that way, however that looks in an advertising way. We did show a campaign with Michelle Obama, and we showed that first, and then we showed another campaign that actually spoke more to the issues about, you're going through this, you're going through that. Why not get in the ballot booth and vote? And I love Michelle, but they were actually more moved by the second ad more than the first. So it really showed that depending on who's giving the message, they weren't, they didn't connect to Michelle in the same way that we might, So it's really important that we speak to their issues.
So, yeah, from a media point of view, I was going to ask you, continue,
I'm
please.
curious for your thoughts too. I think that there's two sort of components to this. First is that traditional outbound marketing. So how do we reach them on the platforms where they're consuming media with messaging that they care about? And so that's finding them on Instagram, less so on Facebook, on Hulu, on Roku, on all of their connected devices. And piquing their interest enough that they become engaged in the process, they feel educated, and then they start to seek out information on their own. And when they start to do that, capturing their attention, so that more inbound type marketing, when someone's searching for issue terms, not just a candidate name, but something like healthcare, when people are reading articles about whatever's going on in the Trump administration or their Senate race or their local race, meeting them with our message and framing whatever that given news story is, whatever that issue is, with our messaging. And having it all be apparent in the ad, not necessarily waiting for them to click off and expect them to consume a lot of landing page content, but there's huge value to the copy that we put into a search ad. There's huge value in a very big display banner that, frames whatever given news article they're reading about. And figuring out sort of that user journey and that flow is gonna be really critical over the course of the next 6 months, not just in the month leading up to Election Day.
Are there some untapped platforms that you see that should be used that haven't been used traditionally?
I really would like to not talk about TikTok anymore. Yeah, I mean, that's the question that everyone has, right? I think the high impact video is a place where we've been underinvested in, specifically connected TV and full episode player type platforms. I think search is a really interesting space when you look at the number of searches on Trump's name and Trump-related terms. It dwarfs anything in the Democratic primary, any major issue, and that's something that, there's a lot of opportunity there beyond just Trump's DR campaign. And then, I think there's more to do in the influencer space, and the more innovative media like gaming consoles and the like, a lot more to do there. But let's start with a high impact video, and then we can get a little bit more nuanced.
So when you think about what's new, there's a few things to consider, and one is the presidential campaigns have the ability to do a lot of these new things that just a lot of the state and local campaigns don't. Because when you look at the reach of these platforms into a congressional district, it's so small that it doesn't make sense for a non-presidential, for any campaign outside of a presidential to do. So that's kind of the first thing that I see. And so when you look at consumption, right, consumption has grown across the board. Where it's grown has been digital, though, which is still a very tough way to reach and persuade voters. I wouldn't say we've cracked the code there. There's a lot of campaigns that are working, and you still have to do a lot of that stuff. And then the other thing that you see is, right, the connected TV has grown, but the growth has really been in non-ad supported areas. So if there's anything we're looking for in 2020, it would be somebody like Amazon Prime to start accepting ads. Now, I'm sure they might start accepting ads. Maybe the last thing they'll accept is political ads, but that would be something that would allow a ton of inventory to come into the market and allow us to reach a lot of voters. But when we look at consumption, particularly amongst an older voting audience, it's still very heavy TV. And, you know, and I don't say that as, you know, like, oh, we want to just keep doing things like we did yesterday, but more in the fact that campaigns are much different than brands. Brands have years and quarters with which to connect to their consumers, or in our case, voters. Most campaigns we run are 6 to 8 weeks. And when you think about, you know, the presidential aside, when you think about where these campaigns start from a name identification standpoint, nobody knows these people. So you have to reach a lot of people right away. And I can tell you, as somebody that buys a lot of media, it's a stark contrast from where you're running TV and where you're not running TV. The seen read herds are, it's almost like you're not running a campaign in those places, and you're buying as much digital, as much radio, as much cable as you possibly can. I just go back to this. You need a little bit of everything, but I don't know if it's going to be necessarily new. I will say one thing about new, though. There's going to be more money that's going to be spent ever in politics. The states aren't going to change, and I don't think the time with which the money is going to be spent is going to change. So I do think the tactics are going to have to change. You might see campaigns that have to go up earlier. Campaigns might decide, heck, I'm going to only invest in TV and hope that somebody fills the hole for me digitally. That's something Priorities USA has talked about doing for the Democratic nominee, whoever it may be. So I would say that the tactics are going to change because we're getting forced into such a cluttered environment for a lot of these down-ballot campaigns that they're going to have to think creatively.
What states are we looking at that are just going to get bombarded and be hating life because they're going to see way too many political ads?
Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina is the perfect storm, Senate governor and presidential race.
NAG.
NAG, yes, thank you. Wisconsin, Arizona, Colorado. There's about 10 of them which will be just wall to wall.
And don't forget about states like Maine, where there's a competitive Senate race, and it's not off the map as a swing state, and there's just not that many people there. It's hard to spend money at all. So we're gonna run into a lot of situations where our paid media budget is saturated, and we have to figure out where to spend those dollars in an impactful way without blowing people out of the water with
a couple of years
insane
ago, we
frequency.
had a competitive Senate race in Alaska, right? First time in a long time. This is 2014. You couldn't spend more than $30 million there. We tried, all of us collectively tried. That was about the limit, and it's not quite the ceiling there in Maine, but when you talk about these smaller states, now North Carolina, Florida, right, you don't hit those ceilings, but Maine, you definitely hit a pretty low ceiling there, and you're right, it's presidential as well. So, and there's a congressional there too.
Yeah.
Very exciting year in Maine.
How about we open this up to some questions from the audience? I'm sure that you all probably find this pretty different and interesting from commercial advertising. So anybody with a question?